Kings Park's had a fire ecology research program for a couple of years now, and it's based around our appreciation that fire is part of the ecosystem of Banksia woodlands that we manage. And it has an impact on a range of factors that are important to us. So it includes biodiversity conservation. We're required to manage the conservation of the biological values in the designated lands that we have, but obviously this information is also valuable to other land managers. But we also know that we need to manage fire risk in our environment, and we're aware of its complicated feedbacks with things like weed management, which are a problem in themselves. So this program's 2 years old, and it's aiming for the long term. So we've got a number of programs. One of them is around trying to understand how individual plant species and how plant traits interact with fire regime elements, and you might have seen Ryan Tagney, who won that race just now on television last night on the news, talking about his research in seed lethal temperatures. Another component is a program that we're undertaking with Parks and Wildlife and Murdoch University with Joe Fontaine, who spoke this morning, about trying to understand the impacts of varying fire interval on the persistence of plant species. And I might be able to talk about that at the end of my presentation, but I suspect not. So the third component is what I want to talk about today, and the reason why I'm talking about that particularly is because we've got data from that, because it's the one that we started earliest and have got the best information for. So it's about fire and weed management. So obviously managing Banksia woodlands for all of the threats and processes is really complex. In my mind, in relation to this presentation, here's my simplification of it. So we want to manage for wrong one, everybody's done this so far. We want to manage for fire risk and for biodiversity. Those are the outcomes we primarily want to address. But we can't manage some of those things directly. Our issues are weeds, and we can manage fire regime. So we want to manage these outcomes indirectly through managing those other issues. And in fact, critically, in this diagram here is the feedback that I've got between weeds and changed fire regime. So we want to see if we can turn that to our own value. Now, firstly, I'm going to talk about the grass-weed cycle, which we've heard a bit about that already, and thanks to Karen and to Vanda to dealing with this issue in advance. So veld grass can be extremely abundant, up to 70,000 seeds per square metre, even 14 months after a fire, and seedlings can survive fire, can survive temperatures up to about 90 degrees, but they're killed at 100 degrees. So they're mostly close to the surface, so they don't like a really hot fire. However, they can germinate from as far as 9 centimetres below the soil surface, so you can't knock them out in an intense fire. They benefit from the post-fire environment, so germination is really high. Individuals can survive fire as well. So, as we know, fire enhances the germination, but also broadly the spread of this species. So on the right-hand side, we've got some data from, actually I haven't credited that, I think that's from the work that Byron Lamont might have been part of, which is the occurrence of veld grass in plots 6 and 30 months after fire. It also adds up to 5 tonnes per hectare of fuels to a Banksia woodland system, and that is distributed in a very nice way to carry fire. It cures early in the season, it develops rapidly after the previous fire, so it makes the site available for burning in conditions that that otherwise wouldn't, and earlier than it wouldn't. So it's enhanced by fire and it enhances fire. So we call this the grass fire cycle. And as Greg noted this morning, there's not that many grasses in the southwest, so it changes the system by its presence. Grass in itself leads to poorer biodiversity outcomes. I heard a presentation last night by Leander Mason, a PhD student at Curtin University, who was talking about its impacts on mygalomorphs, on spiders, trapdoor spiders. Yeah, I don't know why I forgot that. It was only last night. Trapdoor spiders. And of course, potentially, changed fire regime also could have consequences for biodiversity. So trying to break this cycle, We've talked about how to manage weeds in the system, and it's policy for BGPA, as some other people have mentioned, to hit weeds after fire, and it cost us up to about 5,000 per hectare, I believe. Now, naively, perhaps, if we implemented prescribed burning to manage fuels and fire hazard in this environment without considering the weed situation, we could lead to perverse outcomes where we still get more grass, we get poorer biodiversity, we get more hazard, and we have more fires, and we just need to spend more on putting them out. So with that background, we started a research project, which is a long-term project. It has a decadal, so it's going to be going for a while. We started this with in Kings Park and Bold Park, and with the City of Canning, we've also commenced a project and Parks and Wildlife in Jandakot Regional Reserve. We're looking for further partners, and some people here I've already spoken to about this issue. Where we're looking at the impacts of fire and weed management treatments on fire hazard, fuel loads, on vegetation structure, on native species biodiversity, and on weed abundance and cover. We're doing this with 6 treatments. I'll talk about this some more, with short rotation, medium rotation fires, no fire, and plus or minus weed management. We've got 3 sites, as I mentioned. We've implemented fires in those 3. So the first one that we did was in Kings Park in autumn 2015, and that's the one that I'll be presenting the data from today, because it's our longest data series. So the site is in the southern west corner of Kings Park. It's Banksia attenuata and Menziesii woodland with lots of lots of Alocasuarina, jarrah and marri as co-dominants, and certainly veld grass. Here's our 6 blocks. In each block we have 7 plots where we measure the abundance of plant species, and 3 transects where we're measuring the vegetation structure and fuel litter depth and so on. So there's a lot of work involved in that. It takes 40-person days to undertake that work, so it's considerable effort. In 2015, as I mentioned, we burnt this part of that area, so it's bounded by roads and tracks, and it's bisected by a track as well, which is convenient for us. We've got our control right next door, which in hindsight might have been not a good idea. But it does enable us to implement weed management in a single go across those 2 sites. So we've got half of each of those is managed by weeds and half it's not. And then we've burnt part of it, so now we have these 4 treatments. And these are the treatments that I'm going to be talking about today, because we haven't yet implemented the next treatment, which is to burn half of the already burnt site again in a number of years' time to implement a short burn rotation. And then, given time again, we'll burn the whole burn site again, so we've got a short rotation and a long rotation, all of which is crossed by weed treatment. So you can see why this is a long-term study, giving us 6 treatments. There we go. So we undertook the survey in spring, pre-fire, so spring 2014. We counted the number of individuals of all plant species, both native and alien species. We assessed vegetation cover, live and dead, and through a line intercept approach. We measured litter depth, and we collected litter samples from quadrats and weighed that. And we assessed habitat attributes such as canopy cover, bare ground cover, and coarse woody debris. We used a canopy imagery similar to you've seen earlier today. Implemented treatments, and then undertaking post-fire survey of the same form. So we've repeated the pre-fire survey twice already. Now, noting that this study is set up to assess all of those different treatments, specifically about fire rotations, but we haven't done those rotations yet, that time hasn't passed. So what I'm just talking about now is the effects of weed and fire treatments overlay. So this is the site pre-fire, or example of part of the site pre-fire. The burn was, I asked the fire Parks and Wildlife who implemented the burn for us, also with DFS assisting. We had every appliance in the state on the site. We didn't want it to get away. So they implemented it. My instructions were nothing. This is not boutique. Please just implemented as a management burn, and that's that's what they did. So it was mild in parts, and it was more intense in other locations, but it was still within the envelope of a range of variation that they prefer for fuel reduction burning. So we undertook survey the spring immediately afterwards. So this is an example of the site. You can see there's a bit of canopy scorch there. Alocasiarinas are resprouting on their stems, and so on. You can see annuals, and you can see post-fire flowering, and the whole ecology is happening there. So we surveyed at this time, and we surveyed a year later. So this is the following spring, so this is 16 months after fire. You can see more changes. This shows the comparison of, I don't know how clear it is, but on the left, these are both post-fire. On the left with weed management, on the right without weed management. And you can see there's a lot more grasses in that right-hand side. And this is actually, that yellow line I drew on with PowerPoint, so it's not a bit of cable. But there is a yellow flag in the middle, which is the marker line for the edge of the weed treatment. So on the foreground is the weed managed, and the background is without weed management. Now the results all follow this kind of approach. Remembering this is just the Kings Park study. We've got 4 treatments. We did a pre-fire survey in spring. The vertical line is the fire in autumn, and then we've surveyed twice afterwards. I've got 4 colours which show the control treatment, which we've done nothing to except for survey, which is green. The blue, it will be the control, with weed management. Orange is burned and no weed management, and red burn with weed. So firstly, and unsurprisingly, the fire burnt the fuel. So fuel levels did vary amongst our treatment sites pre-fire, and this is the value of getting that pre-fire data so that we can see what the pre-fire condition consequences were post-fire. So there was variation in sites pre-fire. After fire, we found that the fuel had been reduced down to about 2.5 tonnes per hectare in terms of fine litter, which was clearly an objective for prescribed burn that site. Now, the rest of the results are about abundance of plant species and expressed in plants per hectare, so some very large numbers. We've got, this axis goes to 2 million plants per hectare, but that's because we counted everything, not in a hectare, in smaller plots. So this is, initially this is the weeds. So here we can see that post-fire weed abundance had a significant increase. And in fact, you can also see there's some small increase in the sites where we also did weed management, but the weed management had the absence of weed management is much greater weed abundance in that site. This is the sites for native species. You can see native species abundance has increased post-fire. That's not surprising. There's a lot of seedling regeneration in these systems. But what you can see in the bottom there is that the site with the weed control has by far the higher native species abundance. And we suspect that could be part of a suppression from the presence of weeds in the other site where we didn't manage them. So that's again demonstrating the negative consequences for weeds in this system. This is going for a couple of species here. So this is a red-green kangaroo paw. They weren't really very abundant in the site pre-fire, but they had a huge increase after fire. It looks like there's effect for weed control here, but the errors are not separating that effect there. But this is just for 2 years, so we don't know if this is going to, when we reassess this in 6 years and when we start to reassess after our rotations, then what those impacts are going to be. This is an unusual species, a native species, in the sense that it had the opposite. It's an example of a species with the opposite consequences, where it's most abundant in the site that was burned and didn't have weed management. So we're not sure if Thyssinonis is susceptible to the treatment that we put on, and we'll have to investigate. Now this is veld grass. This is the one that's our major concern, and you can see there was variation amongst plots pre-fire, and we didn't realise this till we analysed it, but the site that we chose to implement to burn and to not give weed treatments previously had the highest weed load. But this, again, that's the value of having that pre-fire data, so we can see the change from the pre to post condition, and it tripled in density after fire, whereas the sites that we burned and we managed, we were able to maintain or slightly to decrease the abundance of species. So by having fire and weed management, you've heard this before, is beneficial. We did have a couple of native grasses on the site, and one of them was Ostrastypa compressor, which is a fascinating species because it's an annual, and it almost exclusively germinates after fire, so it lives in the seed bank for a long time. We did have very few, in fact, virtually no individuals on the site pre-fire, but we had quite a lot after fire, and you can see it's most abundant by a long way in the sites that where we had weed management that were burned, and here we're specifically hypothesising that that is an impact of competition from, or release of competition from weeds on that site too. Now, so a couple of bulbous weeds. So for freesia, so a huge increase post-fire, and our weed management did have consequences there, but still we had an increase after fire. Gladiolas, harder to interpret what happened here, but it seemed that the last year, 2016, was a better year for everybody, no matter what happened. Some of these aren't too profound, but it's with data and very clearly demonstrated that fire does indeed increase weed abundance in Banksia woodlands, and that if there is burning, whether it's wildfire or a prescribed management program, that it must be combined with weed management. We haven't shown that those grasses are enhancing the fire hazard on that site as yet, but we expect that the data through time will show changes in litter and so on. But we already know that the grasses add up to 5 tonnes per hectare to the site, and they've done it very quickly, so that's already in place. There may be evidence for a negative relationship between weed abundance and native plant abundance, and I think I'll probably conclude saying that we obviously have to continue surveying this. We have, and we're looking for other partners as well. So, thank you.
Thank you, Ben.